In Privacy Watch, top U.S. security officials are warning lawmakers about potential security risks ahead of this year's midterm elections. FBI Director Christopher Wray, Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats, and Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen briefed the entire House of Representatives today on Capitol Hill.
The meeting was initially scheduled to take place last week before it was rescheduled as a classified meeting today. With more on the warnings, we want to bring in CBS News Chief Congressional Correspondent Nancy Cordes on Capitol Hill. So, Nancy, how did this meeting even come about?
Well, you've got a lot of members of Congress, particularly Democrats, who worry that the administration is not taking the threat of cyber intrusions and the midterm elections, which are now less than 6 months away, and they have been pushing for these security officials to come and brief them here on Capitol Hill. And you mentioned that this briefing was originally scheduled to take place last week. It was going to be an open meeting, meaning that whatever they discussed in the auditorium behind me, members could come out and talk to us about it afterwards. But some Democrats pushed for this to be a classified meeting because they felt that they weren't going to be able to get the depth, the level of detail from security officials like the FBI director if those details could simply be shared with the public afterwards. And so that's why we waited until today to have this meeting. And what the Director of National Intelligence, the Secretary of Homeland Security told these members of Congress is that they are taking the threat very seriously, that they are working with each individual state, which is a pretty daunting task because, as you know, every state has its own election system. Some are paperless, some still cast their ballots on paper, and so they basically need to tailor an approach for each individual state. And of course, some states take the threat more seriously than others as well.
And in fact, Nancy, Secretary Nielsen spoke to reporters after the briefing. Let's play a little bit of what she had to say.
I think we see multiple countries, and the intel community can speak more broadly to this, that do have the capability to do this. So we think about China, we think about Iran, obviously we think about Russia. So we're continuing to watch. I mean, any nation state that has the capability, I think we would be very naive if we made an assumption they just wouldn't use it. So we need to be prepared.
So, Nancy, what exactly are they doing to prepare?
Well, you know, that was a very fascinating comment by the Homeland Security Secretary because she was asked whether there is a threat coming from other actors besides just, you know, the Russians who we know tried to infiltrate some 21 states' electoral systems back in 2016 and actually were successful in a handful of states, although there's still no indication that they actually changed any votes. And as you heard her say, yes, they're worried about China, they're worried about Iran, they're worried about individuals. Trying to, like feel around for vulnerabilities, essentially, and perhaps go even further. That's a concern that a number of members of Congress have as well. And we spoke to one Democratic lawmaker from Illinois. This is Congressman Krishnamurthy. He's from one of the states where the Russians actually did manage to get in the front door of their election system back in 2016. And he felt that he didn't hear enough specificity today about what the administration is doing in advance of the 2018 elections. Take a listen.
Overall, it feels like a bureaucratic response, and I'm not feeling the confidence that we're really kind of addressing the threat square in the face, and most importantly, kind of interacting with the states, because as you know, elections are conducted at the state and local level, and they may not have the resources to deal with it. And I'm not hearing enough about what we're doing to provide them with the resources or the information or the intelligence to deal with the upcoming election threat.
What would you want folks at the state level running these elections to know based on what you just learned?
I think they should be asking questions right now of the folks that presented to us, specifically DHS, like, what are our vulnerabilities?
Okay, so there's a lot of worrying, you've told us, and a lot of hand-wringing. But what, if anything, is Congress actually willing to do?
Well, there was some disappointment in the congressional reaction today because this was a briefing that was scheduled for all members of the House of Representatives. More than 500 members, only about 40 or 50 actually showed up to hear from the FBI director, the Secretary of Homeland Security, which some felt was an indication about how seriously Congress itself is taking this problem. There are bills that are working their way through the system that would try to standardize the federal approach to state elections and to sort of mandate certain standards that would be shared among states. For example, a number of states have moved to paperless election systems, and there's a concern that if there is no paper involved in this process, it becomes much more difficult to create a record in real time that enables you to know afterwards if any votes have been tampered with. That's something that the Secretary of Homeland Security talked about today. That's something that that some members of Congress are working on enshrining in legislation. But there is some pushback from individual states who worry that the federal government is trying to insert itself too much into state election systems. And because each state is so different and runs its own elections, there is a little bit of a concern that if Congress doesn't get this right, if they try to over-involve the federal government, that it'll actually become more onerous rather than less for states to safeguard their individual systems. So it's a balancing act. They are talking with election officials from individual states, and they're having to figure out a way to make sure that election officials in these states have the proper security clearance to actually talk frankly and openly with officials like the FBI director about the threats, because that has been a big problem in the past, Anne-Marie and Vlad, is the fact that there's a lot of information here at the federal level among intelligence officials, but they can't share some of it with these state election officials because before 2016, it never occurred to anybody that so many of them actually needed to have a security clearance so they could talk about some of these threats.
Nancy Cordes, thanks a lot.